Theodora's arrival at college is framed from the outset as an arrival under duress rather than anticipation, and this distinction matters enormously for how we read everything that follows. Because she is not a young woman stepping eagerly into a new chapter of self-discovery, but someone who has been propelled into this transition by her parents' insistence. Someone whose relationship to the milestone of leaving home is shadowed by obligation rather than desire. And this framing immediately establishes a tension between the life Theodora is expected to want and the life she is actually experiencing. A tension that will echo throughout the episode's emotional architecture. The initial conflict over her dorm room, discovering Freya essentially squatting in the space that was meant to be hers, functions on its surface as a minor comedic complication. The kind of administrative snag common to campus-set stories, but it also quietly reinforces the episode's deeper theme of displacement. The sense that Theodora cannot even claim the physical space allotted to her without struggle. That her arrival is met not with welcome but with obstacle. And this detail, however small, contributes to a mounting portrait of a young woman who feels perpetually slightly out of place, entitled to something that keeps being withheld or contested. When resident advisor Spencer steps in to resolve the housing dispute, ordering Freya to vacate the room and return to the arrangement she is actually entitled to, the show establishes Spencer's character through action rather than exposition, showing her as someone who takes her responsibilities seriously, who is willing to enforce fairness even when doing so is met with resistance. And this early scene of quiet authority matters because it sets up the central ethical through-line of Spencer's character for the rest of the episode, someone whose entire professional identity is built around being a steady, trustworthy presence for students who are navigating a disorienting new chapter of their lives. What makes Spencer such a compelling figure within the show's broader thematic concerns is precisely the tension she embodies between genuine emotional warmth and professional restraint, because as she begins to notice Theodora's distress in the aftermath of the housing conflict, sensing that something deeper than a room assignment is troubling her, she does not simply offer surface-level reassurance and move on, but instead makes the choice to sit with Theodora's sadness, to ask questions, to create space for the younger woman to articulate what she is actually going through, and this choice to engage rather than deflect reflects an ethic of care that is central to what good mentorship actually looks like, attentive without being invasive, present without overstepping. When Theodora eventually reveals the fuller picture of her unhappiness, the loneliness of being sent away from home against her own wishes, the fresh wound of her girlfriend, ending their relationship rather than attempt long distance, Spencer's response becomes the emotional center of the episode. And it is worth dwelling on the specificity of what Spencer chooses to do with this information, because, rather than offering generic comfort, she works deliberately to help Theodora rebuild a sense of her own worth, to remind her that the ending of the relationship reflects circumstance and her ex-girlfriend's choices rather than any deficiency in Theodora herself. And this kind of affirming, confidence-restoring attention is a particular gift many queer women recognize as significant, precisely because it is so often withheld elsewhere. Because young queer women navigating heartbreak frequently lack access to adults or mentors who can speak to that grief with full understanding and without judgment. And Spencer's willingness to meet Theodora exactly where she is, queerness included, without treating it as a subject requiring delicacy or euphemism, models a form of care that many viewers will recognize as rare and valuable. It is precisely because this attention is so genuine, so emotionally acute, that the show is able to generate real tension around the question of where it might lead. And this is where the episode's most significant narrative choice comes into focus. Because rather than allowing that tension to resolve into romantic or physical involvement, the show instead follows Spencer through a process of internal reckoning, showing her recognize, honestly and without self-deception, that whatever warmth is passing between them, however charged the flattery, however easy the conversation feels, she occupies a position of institutional authority over Theodora that makes any romantic pursuit fundamentally incompatible with the trust her role requires. And watching Spencer arrive at this recognition, weigh it seriously, and choose to hold the professional boundary even while acknowledging her own genuine feelings, is arguably more emotionally sophisticated than a storyline that simply allows attraction to override judgment. This kind of restraint deserves to be read as its own form of intimacy rather than its absence. Because the choice not to act on feeling, when that choice is made thoughtfully and with clear-eyed awareness of power rather than out of shame or fear, communicates a depth of respect for the other person that mere pursuit would not. And Spencer's internal negotiation, visible to the audience through small hesitations, through the careful way she reframes conversations back toward Theodora's own growth rather than toward herself, models something queer women in mentorship or quasi-mentorship positions navigate constantly in real life. the discipline of caring deeply for someone while remaining vigilant about the asymmetry of power between you, refusing to let genuine affection become an excuse for crossing a line that exists precisely to protect the more vulnerable party. This dynamic resonates powerfully within queer community contexts specifically, because queer women, particularly in educational, professional, or mentorship settings, often occupy dual roles as both source of guidance and object of quiet admiration for younger or less experienced queer women who may be encountering, for the first time, an adult who reflects back an identity they are still growing into. And this kind of admiration, however emotionally intense it may feel to the person experiencing it, carries real ethical weight for the person on the receiving end, who must recognize that what feels like connection may also be entangled with need, with the younger woman's search for validation, representation, or simply proof that a life like the one she's building is survivable and even joyful. And Spencer's choice to hold her boundary reflects an understanding that meeting that need responsibly sometimes means offering steady presence rather than romantic reciprocation. There is also something worth examining in how the show handles the flirtatious quality of their exchanges without allowing that flirtation to curdle into exploitation, because the mutual warmth between Spencer and Theodora is never depicted as one-sided manipulation or predatory intent, but rather as an honest, slightly charged chemistry that exists between two people who might, under different circumstances, have had a very different kind of relationship, and the show's willingness to let that unrealized possibility remain visible, acknowledged but unacted upon, gives the episode a bittersweet emotional texture that feels true to life, because queer women often do encounter people at the wrong moment, in the wrong configuration of power or circumstance, and learning to recognize that wrongness, to grieve the timing without necessarily grieving the connection itself, is its own significant emotional skill. Read through this lens, the episode becomes less a story about a mentor overstepping, and more a meditation on the discipline of care under constraint, the quiet, largely invisible labor of choosing someone else's well-being over your own immediate desire. And this labor deserves recognition as a distinctly gendered and specifically queer form of emotional work, because women, and queer women in particular, are so frequently expected to absorb the responsibility of managing boundaries in relationships where the other party may be less equipped or less empowered to do so themselves. And Spencer's steady, careful handling of her feelings toward Theodora, her refusal to let genuine affection translate into inappropriate action, exemplifies exactly the kind of self-regulation and other-centered responsibility that women are so often tasked with providing, frequently without recognition or reward. What ultimately elevates this episode within the broader arc of the series is its trust in restraint as a narratively rich choice. Its willingness to let unspoken feeling exist on screen without needing resolution to justify its presence. And this approach directly resists the two dominant, equally reductive cultural patterns the broader analysis has already identified: the erasure of queer women's emotional lives on one hand, and the sensationalized collapse of any charged same-sex dynamic into spectacle on the other, because here the show insists on something more difficult and more honest: a portrait of queer affection that is allowed to be real, to be felt, to be witnessed by the audience, while also being held accountable to the ethical realities of power and consent that govern any relationship involving a meaningful authority gap. Theodora, for her part, is left not with romantic fulfillment, but with something arguably more valuable in this moment of her life: the experience of being seen fully and cared for generously by another queer woman who asks nothing of her in return. And this kind of encounter, unremarked upon by mainstream narratives that tend to treat platonic mentorship as a lesser form of connection compared to romance, deserves to be recognized as its own profound form of intimacy, one that queer women in particular often rely upon at moments of crisis, when a peer or elder within the community offers steady presence without complication, without agenda, simply because they recognize a fellow traveler in need of reassurance that she is not, in fact, alone.